we owed it to our audience to find a form which was as complex. And your audience will come up to it. Maybe every audience will not get every complexity. But on the whole, I would much rather throw the complex argument at them and have people take parts of it.
So you now know dark is just a word. It's actually the meaning of light. So it's up to us then to continue to make those films and to find the audiences. After all, we do these things not out of some altruistic motive, some notion of janta ki seva. We do it because we need to do it for ourselves, for our own attempts to understand the world around us, and for our own sanity.
When I meet a 18-year-old college student from Kashmir in Delhi, and she sends me a WhatsApp saying that since I've come to Delhi, I watch your film every month, and it makes me feel so secure. Now, that is why we make films. Are we going to change the world? We don't know who's going to change the world. But I do know that's what I have come to believe, is that we provide through our arguments, through our integrity, we provide a kind of shelter under which people can rest. And people are very sharp.
So I'd like to begin with offering my congratulations to everyone here, to all of you who have put this event together, and to all of us who have gathered as an audience. As a filmmaker, I am aware that the act of survival, the ability to carry on making films over any length of time, is itself an achievement. That certainly applies to film festivals too, for to screen films, especially films that we might define as political, and more importantly, to screen them in a political way, has become an increasingly fraught enterprise. No less difficult than continuing to make films, especially films that are political, and again, made in a political way. But People's Film Collective have done it, brought it this far, and for what you all do, and as importantly, the way you do it, Zindabad. So, the subject of today's, what I'm supposed to speak about, had been pre-decided as where do we find our public? Documentary film in the present. And in the course of writing this up, I thought it might be better to say documentary film and the present. Is it unnecessary or premature to stand here today at what is the 10th edition of the Kolkata People's Film Festival and worry about finding a public? After all, People's Film Collective seem to have found an audience for the films that they bring together, not just over the 10 editions of this annual festival, but for the even more impressive screenings that they regularly host. Those screenings do what we all dream of. They use films that create an argument through image, sound, and text, and then deploy those arguments to prise open a space where people can listen, argue, and have a conversation with the world that we inhabit. And sometimes, the world that we wish we inhabited. That is all we want from documentary films after all, is it not? Our search for a public has been about finding an audience, not just viewers, which is what we are when we watch a viral video on our phones, and not just consumers, which is what we also become when we tune in to watch a documentary on, for example, Netflix. I'll allude to those distinctions again later, but this might be the moment to say that I believe that the real strength of the independent documentary in India has always been its engagement with its audience. Unlike viewers and consumers, an audience suggests a collectivity, the emergence of something that reinforces a sense of community in those gathered. It is out of that sharing in a work, out of that collectivity, that we can create the space for the complex dance between reality, the filmmaker's imagination of it, the film, and its audience. This search for a somewhat old-fashioned notion of an audience might make the documentary film in India appear to be a bit old-fashioned. a dinosaur of a kind. That is not untrue. Although the form we work with has not been static, it is also true that it has not shown an excessive enthusiasm to experiment or to be swept away by the endless possibilities held out by technology. For a useful contrast, just look at the changes in the art world and notice the speed with which new forms have swept into the art gallery, making the contemporary white cube almost unrecognizable. But the documentary has survived, unlike the dinosaur, and kept its voice, I'd say hopefully. For while the change around us is exhilarating, it also leaves us breathless, unable to fully comprehend what those transformations might add up to or where they lead us to. In my own work in documentary films, which has intermittently survived for almost 4 decades, there have been points when it was easy to put your finger on important shifts in technology. It was easy, for example, to recognize the transformative power of video on our work. Less than a decade later, it was almost liberatory to welcome the arrival of digital technology, with new ways of acquiring images, new post-production tools, and the ability to circulate films on a previously unthinkable scale. I'm careful not to call it the video revolution or the digital revolution, which are usages that fail to understand what a revolution really does. A revolution changes things, turns them upside down. At least for a while, Russia, China, Cuba, Iran, those were revolutions. It's also important to remember that these things come in cycles, and I'm guessing that in a previous time, such as when 16mm film first appeared, there was probably as much giddy anticipation of what the changes could lead to. And now we are trying to understand what impact the internet and the social media might have on us. Already we know that even as things get better, they also get worse. What appeared for a time to be the ultimate tool for the democratization of a public conversation turns out to be highly amenable to surveillance and control. In the past, it took a bunch of angry people and a word from a local police station to bring a screening to a halt. Some time ago, it would have been a lot of work to stop the circulation of even 100 DVDs of a documentary. But today, to block a URL and shut down access to a website is a casual, almost trivial act for the state, just as it has become almost effortless to cut access to the internet, as we have seen with the long outages in Manipur, 6 months, and earlier in Kashmir, more than 10 months. A new set of amendments have been proposed to the Information Technology Act 2000, and these clearly mark out how circumscribed the future of the internet and the social media is going to be in this country. In reflecting on the independent documentary film in India and our search for an audience, I'm going to suggest that the making of our films has been inseparable from the making of our audience. Since I have no overarching theory to present in support of this, I'll try and use the methods of documentary film to assemble an argument from a few things that I have observed. There are 2 different, let's call them videos, generated 15 years apart. There is a description of a film that I have made, and some reminders from the recent past of documentary film circulation. Let me begin with the videos. Both are verite material, although these are not from documentary films, and at least some of you will remember having first seen them as independent artifacts. Thinking about them has helped me to get a sense of what it is that we do as documentary filmmakers and what are the promises we make to our audience and to ourselves. The first video that I want to remind you of came from Manipur almost 10 years ago and was widely circulated at the time. Not a film in the conventional sense, but footage of a single event, a kind of image evidence, if you like. I would have ideally liked to have shown it, but it's like 20 minutes long, almost half an hour long, so it would not be practical. The version that I was involved in sharing and screening around 2006 as part of what was called the Delhi Film Archive was about 30 minutes long and was listed in the catalogues simply as unedited footage from Manipur. It begins with images of a protest in an unnamed village where a group of young men confront a posse of armed policemen on a road. Things quickly escalate. The police resort to tear gas shelling, then fire warning shots in the air. It may be live ammunition, but we do not know. After which they chase the young men into the fields that border the road. What follows is a sequence I will always be haunted by. The policemen haul up a group of about a dozen protesters onto the road, beating these young men on their calves with batons until they are arranged in a tidy row. They then call out the first person in the line, hand him a baton, and ask him to beat his comrades. The young man hesitates, so they beat him again, on the calves, again and again, till he's finally hopping and howling with pain. Eventually, this young man does take the baton offered to him and begins to beat the person next to him in the line. But his strokes are not good enough, not strong enough for the police, so they take the stick back from him, hit him a few more times, on the calves, even harder than before, and then hand it back to him. Eventually he succumbs, and grimacing and sobbing in pain, he begins to hit his comrades with full force. He goes down the line, hitting each one in turn, and when he finishes and returns to his place, he's asked to hand over the baton to the second in line. And so it goes until eventually everyone in that line is drawn in, each one first beaten and then in turn beating someone. The air is filled with their howls of pain, and I'm guessing shame as well. Watching it play out all those years ago, like some sort of twisted Greek chorus, I remember thinking about the ways in which the raw intensity of that material was working on us. In some ways, you could read that unedited footage from Manipur like a film with a fairly sophisticated structure. For once you understood what was being asked of the young man, a chilling narrative was laid out before us and filled the viewer with anticipation and foreboding. It made us think of so many things, amongst other things about friendship and loyalty, about courage and shame, and about the perversions of power and inequality. But I do remember being troubled by the fact that even while we screened it, we knew little about what exactly was going on. We eventually figured out that the video was likely shot in 2004 in the tumult that followed the rape and killing of T. Manorama Devi that July, followed by the protests outside the Kangla fort in Imphal, burned in our memories for the disrobing by the Imas, the mothers, and later by the self-immolation by the student leader Chitranjan on August 15th, Indian Independence Day. Without any context to the material we had seen, I do remember feeling rudderless and somewhat panicked. I thought about the Manipur video again recently. As the state went up in flames, it has continued to burn over the past 6 months, forcing us to engage a little more closely with the texture of what lies behind its troubles. It was impossible to ignore that first flurry of shocking images coming out of Manipur, which included the video of a young girl being stripped naked and paraded by a mob. But it was followed by long stretches of silence, throttled in part by the internet shutdown, in just the same way that the internet shutdown in Kashmir has rendered opaque what is being done there to completely silence its people. These videos continue to circulate locally within Manipur, I believe, but only within closed groups, where they only strengthen already entrenched positions. In this war of narratives, people are not even speaking at each other anymore. The second video is more recent and came out of the student protests of December 2019 at the Jamia Millia Islamia in New Delhi. Many of you would recall those harrowing short videos that recorded the brutal violence used to break up the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act right by the gates of the university campus. One memorable one showed a small group of women students gather fiercely in a protective circle around a beleaguered young man, a fellow student, even as the police continue to try and attack him with their batons. You might also recall the chilling CCTV footage from that night, 15th December 2019, as the police break into the sanctuary provided by the reading room of the Jamia Library, using first tear gas and then batons on terrified students, beating and humiliating them before driving them out of the library. Although these videos were being recorded less than 10 kilometers from where I live, not in faraway Manipur, and there was no shortage of context, it was still difficult to fully absorb the significance of what we had seen. It's possible that we could not get a grip on those meanings because those events were soon overshadowed by other protests that sprang up all over the city, most visibly in Shaheen Bagh and eventually all across the country. In Delhi, it of course all ended quite abruptly in February 2020 as a full-fledged pogrom was unleashed on the Muslim neighborhoods of northeast Delhi, and violence was used to completely silence a remarkable unfolding political moment. It was also followed up by an unprecedented crackdown on many of those who had spoken up. It's been 4 years since, and many of those arrested have spent these intervening years with long stretches in prison. Some continue to be incarcerated. I remember watching those videos on my phone, certainly a viewer at that time, perhaps even a consumer, and once again wondering if these represented a new form of the documentary. They were usually short, under 10 minutes long, edited only slightly, almost observational in the way they unfolded, but carrying a startling immediacy and power. But today I'm less sure of those first reactions to the Jamia videos. They retain their visceral charge, but I see that in their raw, unprocessed state, they cannot do what I expect a documentary to do. So thinking about these two sets of videos together, Manipur 2004, Delhi 2019, has also led me to believe that it might also have to do with the fact that those videos do not, and perhaps cannot, engage with its audience in the way that the documentary does. The form we have chosen is not simply about recording something called reality or gathering evidence. It requires more than just context and the offer of an argument. It also needs the suggestion that there is a space for viewers to engage with what they are confronted with. What also distinguishes the form for me, and is perhaps critical to it, is a clear indication of authorship, in that the filmmaker takes responsibility for what she shares with you. When I first watched unedited footage from Manipur, I was one of those who wondered who shot that video, how was that person allowed to be there, and why was that video allowed to be circulated. When a good documentary film encounters the same material, it tries to enter into an honest conversation with it, locates it, and that helps to quell my panic. Without that, however powerful these images might be, they run the risk of evaporating, becoming ephemera, and far too soon. When I say locate, I don't necessarily only mean identify, but I mean in terms of a context. I'm sorry to be anecdotal, but that is the only way I know how to make an argument. I'm going to turn next to a description of a screening of a film made more than 20 years ago, my own film. We had just finished work on Words on Water, a film on the struggle against large dams in the Narmada Valley. In early 2003, while it was still a work in progress and its soundtrack was sort of being tweaked, it was invited to be screened at the Asian Social Forum at Hyderabad, where more than 8,000 people were expected over just a few days. Social movements, trade unions, environmental activists, anti-imperialist and anti-racist groups, and of course, scores of NGOs all had poured onto its campus. As it always is in our part of the world, the screening venue was something of an anticlimax. A modest-sized classroom tucked away on the third floor of a school building that happened to be right next to the campus of the Social Forum. To play in an auditorium like this one must be noted for all of us as a luxury. When the screening room began, When the screening began, the room was only about a third full, and the acoustics were terrible. My anxieties about the soundtrack had been drowned out by the echoes added by the space. Then, about 15 minutes after the film began, the doors of the room were flung open and more people suddenly poured in until the room was quite full. Even in the darkness, I could recognize some of the late arrivals. Activists of the Narmada Bachao Andolan, Kamli Jiji, Kailash, Luaria, some of whom had either already appeared on the screen or were due to. They carried in a noticeable spike in the emotional tone of the room, and the sober silence of a well-meaning audience fractured and gave way to more personal, more visceral responses. I was already nervous. The film had been made over a period of 2 years, and this was the first time people who were involved in that magnificent struggle were going to see it. To my surprise, their response for the most part was laughter. Laughter at seeing themselves on screen, laughter and applause when Kamli Jiji climbed a barricade to harangue the president of the World Bank, rude and raucous laughter when someone waved a fist at the district magistrate of Khargon, and so on. There were also moments of pin-drop silence, especially when people on screen spoke about losing land and home, about displacement, and of the false promises of resettlement. The operative part of the story is about how the screening ended. So let me fast forward to where the end titles of the film begin to roll. Suddenly, in the darkened space, a voice went up, Narmada Bachao, and the echo came from many corners, Manav Bachao. Then more expectantly, Koi nahi hatega, and the answer, Bandh nahi banega. Then just as unexpectedly, as when they had barged in, and as if responding to an invisible signal, the slogan shouters all stood up and walked out. They flung open the doors and marched noisily down 3 floors, the stairwell reverberating with their narebazi. I have a memory of Medha Patkar arriving at just that moment, too late to see the film obviously, so the energized activists grabbed her hand and together they had all trooped out of the building. I watched that long line of slogan shouting men and women for a while as they made their way across the grounds of the social forum. Narmada Ghati Kunri se, Amri se, Amri se. Narmada Ghati kare pukar, dube nahi manav adhikar. Back in the screening room, there was a question and answer session to complete. Not surprisingly, I cannot remember much of the conversation there. But I do remember feeling that my heart was very, very full. The reason I brought up this particular screening was not to lay a claim for some kind of special status for films that engage with social movements based on some sort of apparently organic connection with the ground, with the zameen. It had not been made, after all, to raise the spirits of the Narmada Bachao Andolan, but of the others, those less boisterous people who sat in that room that day, and many others who were not there. But I go back to that screening because it evokes the milieu in which documentary films have circulated, where the first audiences have often been made up of social movements, activist groups, and even socially engaged NGOs, as well, of course, as university and college students. The documentary film in India has been enriched by this relationship with its world in terms of its themes and concerns. And this relationship has been symbiotic, where the back and forth has also helped create an audience for it. This is the ecosystem that is increasingly under threat in India. When I ask the rhetorical question which forms the title of this talk, where do we find our public? This is the audience that we must find and which we must reclaim. I think it's significant that we have at this festival several remarkable examples of these ongoing conversations. Kya Hua Is Sheher Ko, Deepa Dhanraj's film from 1986, which we watched yesterday as part of the Docs That Mattered, came out of her involvement with the activist group Hyderabad Ekta. And so much of her later work is also a part of her much wider engagement with the feminist movement in India. In meticulously drawing our attention to what has been described as the manufacture of a communal consciousness, Kya Hua Is Sheher Ko invites the viewer to think along with her. Later today, we will see Anand Patwardhan's Ram Ke Naam from 1992, a film that shows us how that same communal consciousness came to be yoked to the cause of erasing the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya, sanctioning a bloody process that reached its fruition only a few days ago, on 22nd January. Ram Ke Naam and its incredible circulation over 3 decades is enriched by Anand's long immersion with the civil liberties movement, with screening culture, and from an ongoing conversation with the milieu that his films are about. And as he has himself pointed out somewhat regretfully, it's a film that has never become irrelevant. There was news of Ram Ke Naam more recently too, on 22nd January, even as the media was overwhelmed with news of the temple newly constructed at Ayodhya and its consecration by Narendra Modi. In Hyderabad, a small public screening of the film was disrupted and 4 people were arrested. Elsewhere in the same city, students of Nalsar, the law school, fought to screen the film and succeeded. In Pune, students of FTI organized a screening of the film. And last evening, somebody here talked about the violence that was unleashed on them. I'm sure there must have been many more. I find these to be profoundly moving acts, as if people were gathering under the shelter of a film made more than 30 years ago, hoping the storm will pass and that other worlds will still be possible. At other times, audiences will shelter the film, and I'd like to share my own experience of that solidarity. In 2007, I had finished a film in Kashmir, about Kashmir. In the early days of its screenings in India, Jasn-e-Azadi came under attack by the guardians of the national interests, who decided that the film was anti-national and glorified terrorism. The reaction that followed was remarkable. With documentary filmmakers taking the lead, a target of 100 screenings was set for that same month, and it was achieved. Colleges and universities, activist groups and NGOs, and even dozens of homes hosted those screenings. I was invited to speak at a few in New Delhi. All that the others had to do was to send off an email describing, as anonymously as they wanted to, the when and how of the screening, so that a record could be kept. But the fragile conversation around Kashmir was not stillborn, and it did not stop. It is this shared space between filmmakers, films and audience that I think distinguishes the documentary film practice that we all belong to. This is the precious space that I see as threatened, slowly boxed in by the totalitarian control over public spaces and choked by the increasingly visible regulation of the internet. And notice how nobody even talks of television in India anymore. Since the broadcast media in India first abdicated to state power, then to the highest bidder, and finally to the lowest common denominator in public taste. In the consolidation of this relationship of the independent documentary with audiences in India, there are many important markers. But there is one moment that I feel deserves to be scrutinized and allowed to breathe. It's from around 2002, a few years before or after, which marked a particularly fecund phase, not just for the making of films, but also for their circulation. A comprehensive account of those shifts is contained in several chapters of Towards a People's Cinema, edited by Kasturi and Dwaipayan here at the festival, an anthology I would highly recommend to all those who are interested in documentary film and cultural politics. But briefly, what was going on then? The early videotape formats, U-matic low band and high band, and later Betacam, had stabilized into digital video, TV, and we had been handed the miracle of compact cameras that used the mini DV format. Words on Water, which I completed that year, was shot on the marvelous Canon XL1 by my friend Ranjan Palit. But more importantly, its simplicity had allowed even me to risk shooting more than half of that film myself. Desktop editing systems had entered our world, and all of us were astounded by the fact that picture, audio, and graphics were all the same thing, something they were calling pixels, which allowed you to edit picture, mix sound, color correct, even subtitle your films on what was, after all, little more than a desktop computer. I acknowledge that you can do all this on your iPhone now, but do remember, we're speaking of 2002. Most importantly, these films no more needed to be routed through film laboratories, which were industrial enterprises and whose workings were enmeshed in a clunky censorship regime that had patrolled the borders of filmmaking for more than half a century. Films began to circulate on VHS tape, which then gave way to video CD and eventually to DVD. And though video projectors had been around for a while, they had started becoming cheaper and lighter, and that growing mobility was exponentially expanding the opportunities for screenings. Suddenly, films were being made and circulated and screened as never before. This unshackling, perhaps we can be provocative and use the word intifada here, also allowed for diverse forms of work to engage and encouraged the cultivation of diverse audiences. I'd like us to take a moment here to think on another film that was screened here a few days ago, as part of Docs That Mattered, Reena Mohan's Kamlabai from 1992, the same year incidentally as Ram Ke Naam. There are so many ways in which this film has also been in an extended conversation with documentary film audiences in India, this time around form. It's a conversation that for me had already been triggered by Manjeera Datta's remarkable 1988 film Babulal Bhuiyan Ki Qurbani, The Sacrifice of Babulal Bhuiyan, and Ranjan Palit and Vasudha Joshi's Voices from Baliapal, also made the same year, 1988. It's not a coincidence that all three films were edited by Reena Mohan. The reason to remind ourselves of the enduring appeal of Kamlabai is that it indicates the complexity in the engagement of audiences with the documentary film. This continued in the work of a range of practitioners, and I'm here just taking a few names to suggest where the experimentation was with the form of the film. I could refer here to the work of Ruchir Joshi, who made Tales from Planet Kolkata in 1993. But it was video that gave a real boost to this questioning of form. And I look here to the work of Paramita Vora. I'm looking here at Unlimited Girls in 2002, or the prolific R.V. Ramani, beginning with his film Ni Enge, 2003. All of these films had engaged in broadening the form of the documentary film, but in ways that were also in conversation with their audiences. Different audiences, but audiences all the same. The release in the productive capacities of the documentary filmmaking community and the absence of gatekeeping had clearly been taken note of elsewhere too. One very early indication of it came in 2004, when the Mumbai International Film Festival, MIF, government funded and government run, suddenly raised the bar by asking Indian entries to the festival to produce censor certificates in order to even apply to it. It led to an unprecedented protest by documentary filmmakers who had previously not been very visible as a community. Perhaps because there were suddenly a lot of us, perhaps because a certain critical mass had been reached, but our signature campaigns began to bring together several hundred filmmakers, proud to be taking a stand as directors, producers, editors, sound recordists, cinematographers, and critics in what was initially called the Campaign Against Censorship. MIF had initially stepped back under the pressure, but it soon reverted to a time-honored technique of censorship. They agreed to let drop the pre-censorship clause, but then went ahead and dropped the films they were uncomfortable with anyway, including a slew of films that had been chosen by a formal selection committee that the festival themselves had appointed. And yes, Words on Water was one of them. The newly visible community of filmmakers again rose in protests, but this time it was not just via email campaigns and press notes. One of the forms that this protest took was a counter festival that was organized right across from the main venue of MIF. This is a history that some people here have lived through, but I'm repeating it because I know there are a lot of younger people here. Vikalp was a real place in Mumbai over those few days, spread over the welcoming floors of the Lok Vangmay Griha in Prabhadevi, the publishing and cultural headquarters of the CPI, with 2 good-sized screening rooms, mattresses on the floor, decent audio speakers, and a cheap canteen. The high attendance quickly led to high humidity in the screening rooms, so I do remember a visiting ad filmmaker friend generously arranging for the services of some extra-large studio fans. It was a real festival, and it was cool. People came to watch films, but they also came because it was a place to hang around in, have conversations. It had become a social phenomenon. I see the Vikalp Festival of 2004 as having made an important symbolic point. The independent documentary film was laying a claim on its own behalf, and it was doing it on the ground, not unlike what KPFF has done, I'd say. Perhaps it was the visibility and scale of the Vikalp Festival. There was, after all, a David and Goliath type of ring to its positioning against the well-funded government-sponsored MIF, but it gave the idea of circulating documentaries a huge boost. The itinerant film screening was already a long-established practice for documentary film in India. Anand Patwardhan had been doing it from the late 70s, and there was the Odessa Film Collective in Kerala in the 80s, screening feature films and occasionally documentaries in villages and small towns. Kerala also had the Media Collective, with Sarat Chandran and KP Sasi and their comrades, and a sharp focus on the use of films in the environmental struggles in that state. A few small film festivals had also started popping up, with Marupakam in Madurai in 1998, Pedestrian Pictures in Bangalore in 2001. But in the aftermath of Vikalp, there was the first edition of the Gorakhpur Film Festival in 2005. That remarkable initiative, with its focus on the Hindi-speaking states of northern India, went on to spawn dozens of smaller events under the banner of Pratirodhka Cinema, Cinema of Resistance. I've been associated with them from almost the very beginning and attended many of their festivals over the years in Azamgarh, Banaras, Bareilly, Nainital, Patna, Udaipur. Their admirable insistence that they were not going to accept any form of sponsorship, not accept funds from government or corporate sources, allowed them to stay independent and free and carve out a strong identity in the impoverished cultural space of northern India. In all these instances, the making of films and the creation of an audience were not left to someone else, outsourced to commissioning editors who answered to European and American broadcasters, or co-producers who helped bring in money from funders with their own notions of an audience. Ours was a version of Chairman Mao's walking on 2 legs: make the films and then help make an audience for them. Equally important, it was also marked by the confident emergence of people who saw themselves as cultural activists and not just film curators or film programmers. These were people who had a broader sense of what constituted their audience and what were the other elements that could help bind them together. Bookstalls became a regular feature, and they sold DVDs as well, as did art exhibitions and the performance of music and poetry. And in the great tradition of the French New Wave, where critics became filmmakers, many of the cultural activists soon also turned filmmakers. Amudan and Marupakam certainly did, as did Pedestrian Pictures in Bangalore. And of course, Kasturi and Dwaipayan from the People's Film Collective have also made 2 films. Looking back, I feel that the remarkable spirit and energy of that time lasted the best part of the decade, until at least 2014. I picked that year to acknowledge that the coming to power of the BJP under Narendra Modi altered the social, political, and cultural environment of the country in very significant ways. An assault on our small, carefully cultivated ground was only to be expected. It didn't happen overnight. In 2016, I attended the 10th anniversary of the Gorakhpur Film Festival, and it had seemed like business as usual. But pressure was beginning to build up. Gorakhpur is, after all, Yogi Adityanath's hometown, his gaddi, his power seat. it was not difficult to understand why venues in that town gradually became difficult to book and increasingly expensive, and support from locals, the mainstay of events like these, also began to gradually dry up. Perhaps it was pressure that made people hesitate. Maybe it was just their own timidity. But the net result is that the activities of cinema of resistance all across UP have gradually shrunk. The disruptions of COVID did not help the highly circumscribed state of public spaces. In recent years, it has become almost impossible to find an open-air space where a protest can be held in Delhi. Impossible to rent a hall to hold a public meeting or even a serious conference, leave alone find an auditorium like this one to screen a film. The university and college spaces, which once hosted the most memorable screenings, are entirely closed to anything that does not have the express sanction of the authorities, and this is the way it has been for many years now. As an aside, a few years ago on the JNU campus, there was a widely advertised screening of the fiction film Kashmir Files as a collaboration between the ABVP and something called Youth for Panun Kashmir. Outside the auditorium, trees were festooned with life-sized representations of bodies dressed in ferens, some hanging upside down from branches, meant to stand in for the pandits portrayed in the film. That campus also found space a few months later for the Kerala story, as well as a film called Bahattar Hure. You get the point. There is a sequence in Pankaj Rishi Kumar's documentary, Pathar Chujoiri. It translates from the Kashmiri as the play is on, where Bhand theatre artists are reflecting on their situation. The film was shot in Kashmir around 2000, which were very difficult years, not unlike the present. The repertoire of the Bhand theatre is traditionally made up of anti-establishment themes. So what could they do in those times? We are folk artists, one of the performers says in the film. We live in communion with people, with village folk. When things are bad, we withdraw, disappear under the stones and rocks. When things improve, we'll be back. I've not been able to see the film for a while, and I'm only loosely recalling what I remember, but the sentiment has stayed with me. There is something of an irony here. Is it appropriate to be thinking like this, about withdrawing and becoming invisible, when the Indian documentary is in some ways at its most visible? Every year brings news of fresh laurels. Documentaries from India are showing up on the most visible marquees in the world, at the Oscars, at Cannes, at Sundance, and at IDFA Amsterdam. Although it is hard-won and highly competitive, there is a certain amount of international funding going to Indian documentaries, with co-producers willing to shepherd an idea through the exhausting byways of international co-productions, where each film is sometimes helped along by a dozen producers. The film is important and zealously guarded and nurtured with whatever is required to help it make it on the high table of the international documentary scene. There is no doubt that new audiences open out for these films at a glittering array of film festivals, with a few getting onto international OTT platforms and sometimes even finding a cinema house release. But the audience that we have been talking about so far, the audience that People's Film Collective and Cinema of Resistance and Pedestrian Pictures and so many others have nurtured, must necessarily get left out of this parade. So while we can expect some wonderful films to come out of that international route, they're likely to remain prisoners of the hothouse, zealously guarded by very tight contractual and marketing contracts. The night before I came to Kolkata, I spoke with an old comrade about this talk. Tarun Bhartiya is a filmmaker, a photographer, and an editor, and an old friend of the People's Film Collective as well. He did not approve of my pessimism, my suggestion that, like the Bhands, we might need to withdraw for a bit. I was scribbling it down as he spoke. If it appears dark, then darkness is when you come together, he insisted. The dark is not necessarily a place without vision. Probably to make sure that my spirit stayed buoyant, the next day he WhatsApped me a poem written by his son when Kintang was just 9. The last few lines of his poem make for a nice closing, I think. So you now know dark is just a word. It's actually the meaning of light. So it's up to us then to continue to make those films and to find the audiences. After all, we do these things not out of some altruistic motive, some notion of janta ki seva. We do it because we need to do it for ourselves, for our own attempts to understand the world around us, and for our own sanity. Thank you.
That some of the people, some of the theorists would claim that when in that so-called quote-unquote golden period of FD, when H.N.S. Shastri, Pramod Pati, and Sukhdev were making their avant-garde films, they would say that that's the birth of independent documentary scene in India. And many like us would credit somebody sitting here, Anand Patwardhan, with Waves of Revolution. And that is, for us, the birth of independent documentary in India. And we lay that claim because that opened up an audience. It's true that H.N.S. Shastri, Pramod Pati, and Sukhdev did play with form that FD was never accustomed with before. But it was confined to a very oppressive distribution network that FD was also part of. Now, what Anand did was broke that mold and took the cinema to the people for the first time, I guess, in India's independent documentary scene. And if you have to start with that prehistory, what would be your comment?
No, I think it's not even necessary to sort of, insist on where a phenomenon begins. But I think, just for example, to state that the rediscovery of films division is a relatively recent phenomenon. I don't think people of my generation have memories of anything that FD produced, apart from, let's say, Sukhdev's film 9 Months for Freedom, which was made on the Bangladesh war because it was very topical. But we can't forget that Sukhdev was also the man who made half a dozen propaganda films for FD during the emergency, including films that were... So I think when we speak of the independent film, surely we're not just talking about some kind of formal experimentation or somebody uses animation in an interesting way or, whatever it is. Which is not to take away from the films. Sukhdev has made some wonderful films, Pramod Pati made wonderful films, but all of this is now a kind of revisionist reading of that history. Yesterday, Deepa mentioned about when Kya Hua Is Sheher Ko, the hundreds of screenings that were happened. Did that ever happen with an FD film? Does anybody remember those FD films? I don't. I went to college in a metropolitan city. I went to university. It was not part of our consciousness. So I think for me, it's a non-starter of a debate, and it's some kind of academic nitpicking. Certainly, I would say the mid-70s and the work of Anand and Deepa and people like that was independent, not just because of its funding perhaps, but more importantly for what I have spent the last half an hour talking about in terms of its relationship with the audience. And I'm making a claim here that the independent documentary film comes into its own because of the audience.
As you were saying that independent documentary film is not only made in the editing table, but it's also made how and where it is being screened. And I would kind of try to argue that what you claimed as a good time for Indian documentary cinema, it was also diverse in the sense that many of the films that were finding meaning in those spaces were not always quote-unquote pure films as far as funding is concerned. Many of the films that we have screened were funded and had to go through that very humiliating process of pitching and having to find multiple producers to make those films. And those films have a very different kind of a reception when maybe you're screening to a place where it is seen as a very different, like seen in a, maybe in a European festival, which is seen as a third world people making films about their third world lives. But when you're screened in a very different space where political conversation is possible. So I would argue that even then, the problem that you are locating, it was always there. It's nothing new. It has have always been there.
Yeah, I don't see this as a problem really. I'm just saying that obviously hundreds of films have been made. You know, if you compose a list of interesting films made in the last 30 years, I'm sure we can put together a list of 100 films. I'm just saying that for me personally, and in terms of a distinguishing character, if I'm looking for a distinguishing character, films that come out of the pitching process and that, are enmeshed in that whole machinery, those films could come out of anywhere. But I think that the character of some of the work that we see in this country comes out of that slightly different process. That's the point I'm trying to make. You know.
In that, I would like to add what you have added about the very, in a way, not so optimistical time that we are living in, is the complete eradication of PSBT films.
Yes.
And also how the FD have, for a very brief time, have churned out some of the good films. Now the FD and PSBT, which were both kind of government, semi-government funded, has completely been reduced to non-entity now. And as people who have to choose films every year, you're finding that PSBT films, it had its own issues and own issues of funding and kind of moderating and all those things. But their eraser means that various kinds of films from small cities, from small towns, made by people who are making their first films. For example, I don't know Ajay is here or not, but Ajay's first cry came from Chhattisgarh, and that was the first film from Chhattisgarh, a documentary film from Chhattisgarh, made by a Chhattisgarhi person. So yeah.
No, I think that in terms of funding, there are several kinds of crises that are going on. All of us have at some point or the other been hypercritical of, say, NGOs and their role in all sorts of ways, including sometimes in their funding of films. But we also know that out of the 100 banal films that NGOs might have supported in the course of a year, there were always 5 remarkable films that received some money from NGOs, the larger NGOs who had those resources. Partly because they were not producing your film for you, they were giving you a sum of money. Now, we know what's happened to the NGO space now. The complete sort of demolition of that space. Your references to Films Division or FD or even Doordarshan, those are gone. Because post-2014, there is no notion of the public sphere. I mean, some of us were involved in a long conversation. It was a banner of something called the Forum for Independent Film and Video, to kind of articulate that there was place for a private and a government, but there was also a place for the public. And in some senses, Doordarshan was meant to be a public broadcaster. Ironically, that idea, those arguments, and the kind of writing and, how shall I say, proselytization that we did on behalf of that ended up with the PSBT program, although PSBT never fulfilled that mandate as far as I'm concerned. So the idea of the public sphere has been under attack prior to 2014, but it was, there were attempts to infiltrate the notion of the public, that public was a slightly warmer hue of government. But post-2014, there is no notion of the public. We have state propaganda. It dominates the state apparatus. It dominates our streets. It dominates the private media sphere. But there is no autonomous public space. So I think that is what we also have to deal with.
When you were saying about this, the symbiotic relationship that documentary cinema had with its public, they were screening your films. So one place which has been, before as Arundhati was mentioning before yesterday, I think, that what was happening right now with us has happened in Kashmir a long time back. And you had made a film on Kashmir. I would like to know your experiences of screening that film in Kashmir, and how do you think that symbiotic relationship that film had with its audience had been broken?
So the film that you're referring to, Jashin-e-Azadi, it was a long film, and obviously it was not made for the people of Kashmir. It was made for audiences elsewhere. And I only ever had one public screening of that film. And I knew I was only going to be able to have one public screening of that film, public screening of the kind in Kashmir, and of the kind that we are talking about. So soon after I did the first screening in Delhi, I had already made arrangements in Kashmir. I sort of semi-anonymously booked the only theater that we have there, called Tagore Hall, ironically. And I, with great difficulty, rented a video projector, and I did not do any great publicity. The SMS had just started, and literally 48 hours before the screening, I sent out SMSs. And we had, of course, we had a packed house. I went through the, how shall I say, the rigmarole of printing little numbered cards, because I was told that the only way you could claim that an uncensored film is having a screening is to say that it's by invitation. I don't think it had any legal water, but anyway, I had these little numbered passes which we gave out at the gate. I don't think, I described the screening with this words on water, but I don't think I will ever screen a film in the same way that I screened Jashin-e-Azadi in Tagore Hall on that day, you know, because I was just completely taken aback by the fact that what was their history, what people, everybody in that auditorium had lived through, for them just to see it reflected back in a not hostile way was completely too much. So I won't get into the details, because if it's being recorded, I might get into trouble. But when the first military vehicles appeared on screen, all across the balcony of that Tagore auditorium, the college students who were lurking in the dark started sloganeering, and every time anything happened, the whole hall was reverberating with slogans. So that film was usually had an interval in the middle, for a ridiculous reason that those days DVDs, we didn't have the ability to make very long DVDs. So when the interval came, I took the mic and I said, look, I know you're feeling very emotional, but could we just watch the film now? And you know, we can do the... And one guy ran across to me, gave me a hug, and he said, Sanjay ji, आज के दिन मत रोकिए आप, हम बाद में ठीक से देखेंगे. But today, just let us breathe, you know. And it was mad, because some guy walked up to me, and he was a very elegantly dressed man in a black Pathan suit with a black waistcoat and a black cap, and he had a beautiful black shawl. And he walked up and he took off his shawl and draped it over me and said, this is for you. And I don't know, it was just something. And the film, I couldn't obviously do other public screening. There was no question of that. But I then made DVDs, and I may have actually made a few hundred copies, which were sold or distributed or whatever. And eventually they were copied, so it became like it became something, you know. So once again, in a very different context, because I don't see anything that happens in Kashmir as necessarily connected with the documentary practice in India. I don't, you know. But I could recognize that, and it's true that there also, that film was made in very difficult circumstances. And I always say that that film is made up from gifts from people. In Kashmir, we didn't have a people's movement. We didn't have an activist group to work with us. But I had individuals. And each sequence in that film was a gift from an individual. You know, so it's a film which is really like put together, cobbled together by spaces that were opened out to me. So it was not that I had a script or that, I had a fixer on the ground or, we had a production schedule or any of that. It was just that, you stumbled into something and somebody took you somewhere and somebody else took you the next day somewhere else and slowly you constructed it. Yeah.
But I would like you to talk about another aspect of screening in political spaces, which, as you said, is fast shrinking all over India. Is that why, beyond this festival circuits, when political documentary is being screened, it is being screened for the issues, right? And as a filmmaker, when you make film, you are not making a pamphlet, you are making a film. And the ways it is screened in most places, and how it is treated as an issue, as a pamphlet, as a tool, is a very frustrating for a filmmaker and for the film itself. And I think that to have that shrinking had also to do with the fact that a film, when it is reduced to mere tool, what it can do, you never ask an author that what an author can do with a book. Book has its intrinsic value, and sometimes these political spaces, with its all merits and all political conversation that ensues after that, sometimes limits that. And I would argue that this long life that we had of political documentary spaces had also sometimes have completely been blind to the fact that you need a certain kind of projector, you need certain kind of screen spaces, you need certain kind of, ambience and certain kind of even questions to the filmmaker.
So I'm going to use this opportunity to talk about something else, which is something I have experienced myself. When I worked on the film on the Narmada, Words on Water, because I was so sort of, how shall I say, I was swimming in the waters of that movement, I do feel that I sort of felt that I must kind of complete the argument they were making at that time, because theirs was a changing argument. There are many films have been made on the Narmada, and Semantini and Anand have made one as well. So I know that when I look at the film now, I like the film, but I asked Deepa this question, that would you have made it differently? I think when I see that film, it works, I like it, but yeah, I would have made it differently. And when I made Jashn-e-Azadi, I made it that differently. I made the film that I wanted to make, because I was not necessarily swimming in a movement or anything like that. I said, I'm going to make this film and find a form for it. And I was extremely, extremely lucky to find a collaborator like Tarun Bhartiya, who edited it. We said, let's make a film we want to make. And Tarun had never edited a long feature film before, a documentary before. And let's find a form, however awkward, unwieldy. So we made a film which is 2 hours and 19 minutes long. It doesn't have characters. It has no clear narrative arc. It's circular. And yet, it's the film that I have made that most circulates. And I'm not talking about in Kashmir or in Delhi or wherever. It circulated. I've screened that film in the cinema resistance spaces, Pratirodh Ka Cinema. I've screened we have an Urdu version of it. I've screened it in small towns. And what took me aback was how we had been shortchanging our audiences. That the complexity of the argument that one was trying to make, the audience had no problem with it. And to me, that was fantastic. I think for me it was a great learning, and I only have made one other long film after that. But I know that at quite a late stage of my life and of filmmaking, I learned a very important lesson, that simply because we were making films about urgent issues or in the political space, we didn't have to, we owed it to our audience to find a form which was as complex, and your audience will come up to it. Maybe every audience will not get every complexity, But on the whole, I would much rather throw the complex argument at them and have people take parts of it. Yeah, so for me, I understand the point about the lack of regard, this issue-based thing. So people have so often told me कि आपके पास कश्मीर का कोई आधे घंटा का होगा, आप इसका थोड़ा सा दिखा सकते हैं. And I'm saying, but yeah, but if I could, I would have made it in. So I always tell people that. So I showed my film called Red and Dream, which will be screening here in Punjab. And it had been organized by some left groups in Ludhiana. And this young activist raised his hand in the Q&A. He said, नहीं देखिए हमारी ऑडियंस जो है वो बहुत सिंपल है, गांव की ऑडियंस है, तो ये जो आपका ये लंबी फिल्म है और बहुत कॉम्प्लिकेटेड है, तो ये हम लोग कैसे समझेंगे? So I have a formulation which I use as a kavach. I said, see, अगर हमको कभी पैम्फलेट लिखना है ना, तो हमको पैम्फलेट बनाना चाहिए, पर्चा बनाना चाहिए. अगर पर्चे की ज़रूरत है तो पर्चा बनाना चाहिए, अगर पैम्फलेट की ज़रूरत हो तो पैम्फलेट बनाना चाहिए, और अगर कभी कभी किताब की ज़रूरत हो या नॉवल की ज़रूरत हो तो नॉवल बनाना चाहिए. तो वो एक ही चीज़ नहीं है. So it ended. It was not unpleasant. The organizers very sweetly announced that Sanjay ji is here, and anybody who wants to donate money or buy a DVD can do so. So I was sitting at this table, and people were going past and buying the DVDs, and some people were just coming and putting down 500 rupees. And one guy came up to me and said, वो आपने बहुत ठीक बोला, ये हमारे कॉमरेड जो है ना, ये सिंपल कर करके हमारा दिमाग खराब कर रखा है इन्होंने. So without it watering down my politics, I think that one of the things that we can do and should do is to, if we feel like it, I'm not saying that everybody needs to make a convoluted structure for a film, but if you need to, I don't think we should shortchange our audiences and presume that they're not going to get it.
And that's my last question, and that comes from your last argument. What does a film do, right? What is that one is expected from a film? From a fiction film, the answer is more complex and more varied. But I think from a documentary film, the answer should be no less varied and no less complex. And a film, the understanding, a very, very gross form of Marxist understanding would be film would change the world. In their own sense, that would mean 10 people would enthused and 100 people will enthuse and a revolution will happen. That doesn't happen that way. And precisely that understanding is what is kind of blocking any aspiration of revolutionary change, I would argue. But my point is, what can it do? That very simplistic understanding that documentary film is like, as you said, a parcha. But what it does, what can it do?
Yeah. I think my answer might change depending on when you ask me this question. But today, 4 days after January 22nd, I think one of the important things that we can do as filmmakers is provide a shelter. I think when I referred to Ram Ke Naam and the screenings as being a kind of like an umbrella that people had put up, a chhatri under which they were thinking, to me that's a very valuable thing. So when I meet a 18-year-old college student from Kashmir in Delhi and she sends me a WhatsApp saying that since I've come to Delhi, I watch your film every month and it makes me feel so secure. Now, that is why we make films. Are we going to change the world? We don't know who's going to change the world. But I do know that's what I have come to believe, is that we provide through our arguments, through our integrity, we provide a kind of shelter under which people can rest. And people are very sharp. When they can watch a film and they can see through the bullshit. They can watch a very well-crafted film and they know, yeah, okay. But they know where is,
Yeah, so not just shelter, I would use the word vaccine actually. Because we run this school where, very young children come and study. And we were so scared about January 22nd that in December we decided to vaccinate our students preemptively by showing them Ram Ke Naam and having a big discussion about it, like a no-holds-barred discussion. And what happened was incredible. I mean, when they just when the storm came on 22nd and they were flooded on their WhatsApp and everything, they could stand up and they could actually go on to make their parents understand, their neighbors understand that, you should see through this. And we know, because we are very convinced, because we have gone through it. And we told them that, what we are showing you, that's not the end of it. You go and cross-check. You find it out for yourself. This is just one little conversation we are beginning. And let me tell you, Ram Ke Naam is a very big vaccine, which we should give to our children, and it works.
Actually, 2 days back, I wrote a post on Facebook after watching the films on the first day, that these films are acting like medicines to a very serious disease. Light in the time of darkness. I think you saw the post I wrote there. So very similar to what Kasturi said.
So someone talked about vaccines. I'd like to say that Red Ant's Dream is a brilliant vaccine. It practically makes you question why the world's longest rebellion exists in the world's largest democracy. So yes, it's well deserved. My activism started because of you, sir. But my question to you there remains is a very fundamental question of funding. Even when I try to write, maybe fiction or a few words that I write, there always comes up a question of funding, and especially in arts. And we see that capital is threatening every art we know, films, stories, even intellectuals with think tanks and everything. So how does one resist capital when it is practically changing everything, when you have commercial cinema pushing fascist injections into our minds, and the only form of resistance can be seen as pathetic films like Jawan or Pathan, which are like just a cheap cash grab. So how does one resist that?
So I think for the documentary and for the independent documentary, which is I think what we are talking about today, I always say that when I go to see films made by my peers, my colleagues, it's always a mystery of how they funded it. It's only when the end titles roll that you see where they got money from, and it's always a surprise, So somebody got money from a grant, somebody got money from an NGO. My Kashmir film could be begun because Words on Water got a very large cash prize at a festival in Brazil. I got a post-production grant from, the Jan Ryman Fund. And I was not a young person, and I had never received any kind of international grant. So I think that films will be made, however. In the past, I think it was a bigger issue. Today, it's not a joke to say that you can make a film on an iPhone, and maybe you may not be able to find very easily the resources to make a 2-hour, 19-minute film. But I think that especially with filmmaking now, I don't think we need to throw up our hands and say we are fighting capital. We are fighting capital, but capital has also provided us with the tools of the iPhone or for desktop editing or whatever it is. So films are made, catalogs of this festival and other festivals, you look through them, there are dozens of people making films. 80% of them may not be very nice films, not very interesting films, but there are interesting films being made all the time. So I would just say, I'm not asking you to ignore this, but I'm just telling you that this is not the bottleneck anymore. There are ways in which films can be made.
So we would like to go this conversation far, but we don't have time. And I'll ask Sriyottama to hand Sanjay a gift that we have. It is a photochitro made by Sirajdola Chitrapar.
이게 바꿔져